The December wind cut through Manhattan like a blade, sending designer coats flapping and forcing even the most hardened New Yorkers to duck their heads. But Michael Graves barely felt the cold as he stepped from his bulletproof Bentley onto Fifth Avenue, his mind already racing through the day's conquests. At 45, Michael commanded an empire worth $8 billion. Presidents answered his calls. CEOs begged for meetings. The financial world held its breath when he spoke. But what if everything you built was about to crumble because of one conversation? His daily routine never varied: exit the Bentley at precisely 8:45 a.m., stride past the Limestone Cafe, grab his Ethiopian single-origin espresso, then disappear into his obsidian tower. Control. Precision. Predictability. Today, something shattered that rhythm. She sat there like she'd been waiting her entire life for this moment. A black woman, maybe 50, wrapped in layers of Salvation Army clothes that couldn't hide the intelligence burning in her dark eyes. Her cardboard sign trembled in weathered hands, but the words were written in perfect penmanship. Help me and I will tell you a secret. Have you ever felt like someone was staring straight into your soul? Comment below where you're watching from, because what happens next will haunt Michael forever. For 3 weeks, Michael had walked this exact route. 3 weeks of stepping around the invisible people who populated New York's concrete jungle. But today, those piercing eyes locked onto his like heat-seeking missiles, and everything stopped. Time. Traffic. His heartbeat. Mr. Graves. Her voice cut through the city chaos with surgical precision. Michael's security detail tensed, hands drifting toward concealed weapons. But he raised his palm, freezing them mid-motion. Something about this woman's gaze felt inevitable. You don't know me, he said, his billion-dollar confidence wavering for the first time in decades. Oh, but I do. The woman's smile held secrets that could topple governments. I know about the Anderson merger. I know about your offshore accounts. I know about the night your father died. The night his father died. Those words hit Michael like a sledgehammer to the solar plexus. Nobody talked about that night. Ever. If someone knew your darkest family secret, would you run or face the truth? Let me know in the comments, because Michael's about to make a choice that changes everything. Who are you? His whisper barely escaped his throat. My name is Olivia Washington. She struggled to her feet with dignity that no amount of poverty could erase. And I've been waiting 43 years to have this conversation. 43 years. Michael's mind raced backward through time, searching for connections, explanations, anything that made sense of this moment. But his memory banks came up empty, until they didn't. Washington. The name triggered something deep in his subconscious, like a key turning in a rusted lock. I don't understand, Michael said, but his voice cracked with recognition he couldn't quite place. Olivia tilted her head, studying him with the intensity of a scientist examining a rare specimen. Your father never told you about Evelyn Washington, did he? Evelyn Washington. The name exploded through Michael's consciousness like a nuclear blast. Suddenly he was 7 years old again, hiding at the top of the stairs, listening to hushed conversations that stopped whenever he appeared. She's going to destroy everything, Richard. The baby's not yours, it can't be. Pay her whatever she wants, just make this disappear. Subscribe now if you want to know why this homeless woman holds the key to Michael's entire existence, because what she reveals next will shatter his world. Evelyn was my mother, Olivia said quietly, watching recognition dawn across Michael's aristocratic features. And Richard Graves was my father. The words hit Michael like a physical blow. The Manhattan street tilted sideways, sounds becoming muffled and distant. His father, the pillar of conservative values, the man who built the Graves fortune on family principles, had a secret child. A black secret child. "That's impossible," Michael whispered, but even as he spoke, he saw it. The shape of her nose. The stubborn set of her jaw. The way she held her head when she was thinking. She looked like his father. "Is it impossible?" Olivia reached into her tattered coat and pulled out a manila envelope. DNA test results. Hospital records from 1979. Bank statements showing hush money payments that stopped the day your father died. Her smile turned razor sharp. Everything your family lawyers thought they buried. If you discovered you had a sister who'd been living on the streets while you lived in luxury, how would you react? Comment below, because Michael's response will define who he really is. Michael's knees nearly buckled. The envelope looked innocuous: yellow paper, bent corners, coffee stains. But inside those pages lay the power to detonate everything he'd ever believed about his family, his legacy, his right to the Graves fortune. How? The word escaped him like air from a punctured lung. "Your father cut off the payments when I turned 18, Olivia said, her voice carrying 4 decades of accumulated pain. "Said I was old enough to make my own way in the world." Easy words when you're not a black woman with no education, no connections, no family name to open doors. The pedestrian traffic flowed around them like water around stones. Nobody looked twice at the billionaire having his world shattered in broad daylight. In New York, public breakdowns were just Tuesday morning entertainment. This is why Michael's hands shake every morning. This is the secret that's been eating him alive without him even knowing it existed. "What do you want?" Michael asked, his voice barely audible above the street noise. Olivia stepped closer, close enough that he could see the network of laugh lines around her eyes, the gray threading through her hair, the strength that no amount of hardship could break. "I want you to remember that you had a sister who grew up in foster care while you grew up in mansions." Sister. The word rewrote Michael's entire life story in real time. "I want you to remember that while you were at Harvard, I was sleeping in subway tunnels." Her voice never wavered, but tears began sliding down her cheeks. "I want you to remember that every dollar in your trust fund could have lifted an entire family out of poverty, your family. If your father had betrayed not just you, but an entire other family, would you feel responsible?" Hit that subscribe button and let me know, because what Olivia asks for next will test Michael's soul. Michael looked around desperately, at his security team, at his idling Bentley, at the glass towers that represented his dominion over this concrete jungle. All of it suddenly felt like monuments built on graves. "Money," he said desperately. "You want money. How much? 50 million? 100 million? Olivia laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a hurricane. "Money? You think this is about money?" She shook her head with something that might have been pity. "Michael, this is about family. This is about justice. This is about you finally understanding that your silver spoon was tarnished with someone else's blood." "Then what do you want?" "I want you to help me find the others." The others. Those 2 words made Michael's vision blur. Others? Your father was a busy man, Michael. Evelyn Washington wasn't his only secret. Olivia's smile could have frozen the Hudson River. There are 4 more of us scattered across this country. 4 more children he abandoned. 4 more families he destroyed to protect his precious reputation. If you're not subscribed yet, click that button now, because what Michael learns about his father will redefine everything he thought he knew about power, privilege, and family. The revelation hit Michael like lightning striking twice in the same spot. 4 more siblings. 4 more lives his father had discarded like yesterday's newspaper. 4 more people who had the legal right to claim chunks of the Graves fortune. And if I refuse? Olivia tucked the manila envelope back into her coat with the care of someone handling explosives. "Then tomorrow morning, Every major news network gets copies of these documents. The DNA results. The hospital records. The proof that Richard Graves spent 40 years covering up his black children while preaching family values to white America. She turned to walk away, her cardboard sign fluttering in the December wind like a battle flag. Wait. Michael's voice cracked like a whip across the sidewalk. How do I know you won't take whatever help I give you and disappear with the money? Olivia paused, looking back over her shoulder with eyes that held both infinite sadness and unbreakable determination. Because unlike your father, I keep my promises to family. What would you do if everything you inherited was built on lies? Subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because Michael's decision in the next chapter will determine whether he becomes the man his father was, or the man he was meant to be. Michael stood alone on the sidewalk, watching his half-sister disappear into the crowd of faceless New Yorkers. The manila envelope's weight seemed to follow him, pressing against his chest like a lead blanket of truth. His phone buzzed. A text from his assistant, board meeting in 15 minutes. The Johannesburg deal needs your signature. The Johannesburg deal. South Africa. Another country where his father had business interests that were never quite explained. But as Michael stared at his phone, all he could see was Olivia's face. All he could hear was her voice, "There are 4 more of us." The glass towers of Manhattan stretched toward heaven, but for the first time in his life, Michael Graves wondered if his family fortune was built on foundations that reached straight down to hell. The secret is out, but this is just the beginning. Make sure you're subscribed because what Michael discovers about his siblings will shake the very foundations of American wealth and power. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a 7-year-old boy who used to hide on staircases whispered the question that would haunt him forever. If father lied about this, what else did he lie about? What do you do when your entire life turns out to be a lie built on someone else's suffering? 72 hours had passed since Olivia Washington shattered Michael's world on Fifth Avenue. 72 hours of sleepless nights, untouched meals, and board meetings where he stared at contracts without seeing the words. The Johannesburg deal sat unsigned on his mahogany desk, $300 million of South African mining rights that suddenly felt like blood money. Every time Michael reached for his pen, he saw Olivia's face. Every signature looked like his father's name. Richard Graves, pillar of conservative values, family man, secret keeper of the highest order. Sir. His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. The Goldman Sachs team is here for the 2 p.m. Michael stared at his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows. When had he started looking so much like the old man? Same aristocratic nose. Same cold blue eyes. Same ability to compartmentalize human suffering into quarterly profit reports. If you discovered your wealth came from abandoning black children, would you feel guilty or entitled? Comment below, because Michael's about to learn the difference between charity and justice. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. Central Park. Bethesda Fountain. 1 hour. Bring the checkbook Daddy taught you to hide behind. Oh. Michael's hands shook as he canceled his afternoon meetings. The Goldman team could wait. Wall Street could wait. For the first time in his adult life, something mattered more than money. Central Park in December felt like a frozen cathedral. Bare branches reached toward the gray sky like desperate prayers while joggers puffed through the bitter air, their breath creating temporary ghosts that vanished as quickly as they appeared. Olivia sat on the fountain's edge, feeding breadcrumbs to pigeons that seemed unafraid of her presence. She'd cleaned up since their last meeting, hair washed and braided, clothes mismatched but dignified. But those eyes still held 4 decades of accumulated rage. You came, she said without looking up. Did I have a choice? Michael's breath steamed in the cold air. There's always a choice, Michael. That's what Daddy never taught you. A pigeon landed on her outstretched hand, and she smiled with genuine warmth, the first real emotion he'd seen from her. He taught you that money solves problems. That wealth makes you untouchable. That poor people exist to serve rich people's convenience. Subscribe now if you want to know why Olivia's been planning this confrontation for decades. Because what she reveals next will expose the true cost of American privilege. Michael sat beside her on the cold stone, maintaining careful distance. What do you want from me, Olivia? I want you to meet your family. She gestured toward a cluster of park benches where 3 figures sat waiting. Your real family. The ones Daddy threw away like yesterday's trash. No. Not possible. The first figure stood, a Latino man in his early 40s, wearing a mechanic's jumpsuit with Rodriguez Auto Repair stitched on the pocket. His face carried the unmistakable Graves jawline, the same stubborn chin that stared back at Michael from mirrors. This is Marcus, Olivia said quietly. Born Marcus Graves Rodriguez in El Paso, 1982. Your father promised his mother citizenship papers in exchange for silence. She's still waiting for those papers from her grave in Juarez. The second figure rose. A Native American woman in her late 30s, long black hair braided with silver threads, wearing a faded University of New Mexico sweatshirt. Angela Graves Yazzie, Olivia continued. Born on the Navajo Reservation in 1985. Your father was investigating casino licensing deals. Her mother was 17. Your father was 43. The third figure approached slowly, a young black man, maybe 25, with artist's hands and eyes that held too much knowledge for his age. And this is Jerome Washington Graves. My nephew. Born in Atlanta, 1999. Your father's last known child before he decided to get a vasectomy and focus on legitimate family planning. Hit that subscribe button now, because what these 3 siblings reveal about their lives will destroy every assumption you have about privilege and power. Michael stood on unsteady legs, his world rewriting itself in real time. 3 more siblings. 3 more lives his father had discarded. 3 more people who looked like fragments of the man he'd worshipped his entire life. This is impossible, he whispered, but his voice carried no conviction. Marcus stepped forward, calloused hands clenched into fists. Impossible? You want to know what's impossible? Growing up in foster care while your half-brother lives in a mansion 20 miles away. Working 3 jobs to pay for community college while you get handed Harvard on a silver platter. How would you react if you met siblings who suffered while you lived in luxury? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because what happens next will test everyone's humanity. Angela's voice carried the weight of centuries. My mother died waiting for child support that never came. Alcohol poisoning at 24 because she couldn't live with the shame of trusting a white man who promised her the world and delivered nothing but a mixed-blood baby nobody wanted. Jerome's hands shook as he spoke. My grandmother raised me on food stamps and government cheese while you were learning to play polo at private school. But hey, at least we got Christmas cards for the first few years, right? Christmas cards. The words hit Michael like a physical blow. He remembered his father's annual charity giving, anonymous donations to various causes that made the family look philanthropic without getting their hands dirty. He sent you Christmas cards. Until we turned 18, Olivia said with bitter laughter. Then suddenly we stopped existing. Amazing how legal adulthood makes inconvenient children disappear from rich men's consciences. Michael looked at these 4 people, his siblings, his father's abandoned children, his family's greatest secrets made flesh, and felt something inside him break apart. If you had to choose between protecting your inheritance or acknowledging your family, what would you choose? Comment below. Because Michael's decision will determine whether he repeats his father's mistakes or breaks the cycle. What do you want? Michael's voice cracked like breaking glass. We want what was always ours, Marcus said, his mechanic's hands steady as bedrock. Equal shares of the Graves' fortune. Every offshore account, every trust fund, every stock portfolio Daddy built on the backs of our mother's suffering. The legal implications hit Michael like lightning. Equal shares. The estate is worth $8.4 billion, Angela finished. Divided by 5 legitimate heirs. That's $1.6 billion each. Plus interest, Jerome added quietly. 43 years of compound interest on stolen inheritance. $12 billion. The number made Michael's vision blur. Even divided equally, it would still leave him with more money than most countries' GDP. But it would also mean admitting everything. The affairs, the abandonment, the systemic racism that built the family fortune. Subscribe and tell me what you do, because what Olivia demands next will force Michael to choose between his reputation and his soul. And if I refuse? Michael asked, though he already knew the answer. Olivia pulled out her phone, fingers hovering over the screen. Then in exactly 60 seconds, I send these DNA test results to CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, and the Wall Street Journal simultaneously. By tomorrow morning, the Graves family legacy becomes a cautionary tale about white privilege, abandoned children, and generational wealth built on racism. The park seemed to hold its breath. Joggers passed without noticing that 5 people were about to reshape American conversations about race, wealth, and family responsibility. 50 seconds, Olivia said calmly. Michael's mind raced through possibilities. Legal challenges. Paternity disputes. Media management. All the weapons his father had taught him to deploy when inconvenient truths threatened the family name. But then he looked at Marcus's calloused hands. Angela's proud bearing despite obvious poverty. Jerome's artist fingers that had probably never held anything more valuable than paintbrushes. Olivia's eyes that held 4 decades of patient, dignified suffering. These weren't enemies. They were family. 40 seconds. If you were Michael, would you fight or surrender? Hit that subscribe button because his answer will echo through generations. Wait. Michael's voice cut through the December air like a knife. I need time. This changes everything. Time. Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. We've given you 43 years of time, Hermano. How much more do you need? The lawyers alone. No lawyers, Olivia said firmly. This stays between family until we decide otherwise. You help us track down the remaining siblings, acknowledge us publicly, and divide the inheritance fairly. Or we destroy the Graves' name so thoroughly that your great-grandchildren will change their surnames. The remaining siblings. Michael's blood ran cold. How many more? 2 that we know of. Maybe 3. Angela's voice carried ancient pain. Your father was very busy during his business trips to reservations and border towns. Amazing how many indigenous and Latina women trusted a rich white man who promised to take care of everything. 7 total siblings. Possibly 8. All abandoned. All suffering while Michael lived in luxury. I need 72 hours, Michael said quietly. You need 30 seconds, Olivia replied, her thumb still hovering over the send button. Because in 30 seconds, I'm going to find out whether Richard Graves raised a son or just another version of himself. What would you choose, your comfortable lies or uncomfortable truth? Comment below where you're watching from because Michael's next words will define his entire future. The fountain behind them had frozen into twisted sculptures of ice, like time itself had stopped to witness this moment. For abandoned children faced their privileged brother, waiting for him to choose between wealth and righteousness. 20 seconds. Michael looked at each face, Marcus's defiant strength, Angela's quiet dignity, Jerome's artistic soul, Olivia's patient rage. Then he looked at his own reflection in the fountain's ice, seeing his father's features staring back. For the first time in his life, he hated what he saw. 10 seconds. Michael closed his eyes, thinking of every Christmas morning in the mansion while these four scraped by on scraps. Every Harvard semester while they worked minimum-wage jobs. Every business triumph built on the foundation of their mother's broken promises. 5 seconds. I'll help you find them. The words escaped him like a confession, like a prayer, like the first honest thing he'd said since learning to lie with numbers and stock options. Olivia's thumb stopped hovering over the send button. If you want to know whether Michael keeps his promise or tries to destroy his siblings first, make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next will determine if the Graves family legacy becomes a monument to justice or a cautionary tale about the true price of American wealth. All of them, Michael continued, his voice growing stronger. We find all of them. We acknowledge them. We make this right. For the first time since their father's funeral, the 5 children of Richard Graves stood together as family. But in the back of Michael's mind, a single question echoed like a warning bell. If father abandoned this many children, what other secrets are buried in the family fortune? The answer, he suspected, would either save his soul or destroy everything he'd ever believed about the American dream. Tomorrow, the real work begins. What happens when you realize your entire family history is a carefully constructed lie? The Graves family mansion in the Hamptons hadn't seen this much activity in decades. Built in 1962 as a monument to old money respectability, its Georgian columns and manicured grounds had hosted senators, Supreme Court justices, and 3 generations of America's financial elite. Today, it hosted something far more dangerous, the truth. Michael stood in his father's study, surrounded by mahogany shelves lined with first-edition books that had never been read and awards that celebrated a man who never existed. The massive oil painting of Richard Graves dominated the room, stern face, steel-gray hair, the look of a man who believed his own mythology. But even oil paint couldn't hide the lies anymore. Found something. Marcus's voice carried across the room as he pulled a leather-bound ledger from behind a row of fake philosophy texts. Your daddy kept detailed records of his extracurricular activities. If you discovered your father kept a secret ledger of abandoned children, would you want to read it? Comment below where you're watching from, because what's written inside will rewrite American history. Olivia, Angela, and Jerome gathered around the antique desk as Marcus opened the ledger. Pages and pages of meticulous handwriting, dates, locations, names, amounts paid. Not business transactions. Hush money transactions. Jesus Christ, Michael whispered, scanning the entries. Don't take the Lord's name in vain, Angela said quietly. We're going to need all the divine intervention we can get. The ledger read like a roadmap of systematic exploitation spanning 4 decades. June 1978, E. Washington, Harlem Hospital, $50,000. March 1982, C. Rodriguez, El Paso General. $35,000. September 1985, M. Yazzie, Indian Health Service, $25,000. December 1999, L. Washington, Grady Hospital, $75,000. And more. So many more. Subscribe now if you want to know how deep this conspiracy goes, because what they find next will expose a network of abandonment that reaches the highest levels of American power. There are 12 entries, Jerome said, his artist's hands tracing the careful penmanship. 12 women. 12 children. 12 families destroyed so one white man could maintain his reputation. Michael sank into his father's leather chair, the same chair where he'd received lectures about family values and personal responsibility. The irony tasted like ash in his mouth. Look at the amounts, Marcus pointed to the numbers. They get smaller over time. Your daddy learned that desperation makes people accept less. 50,000 in 1978 had the purchasing power of almost 200,000 today. By 1999, he was paying 75,000 to silence a lifetime of pain. It's not just about the money, Olivia said, studying her father's handwriting with forensic intensity. Look at the locations. Harlem, El Paso, reservations, inner-city hospitals. He specifically targeted communities without political power. The pattern was as clear as it was sickening. Richard Graves hadn't just abandoned random children. He'd systematically exploited women of color, knowing their communities lacked the resources to fight back against a billionaire's legal team. If a powerful white man systematically targeted women of color for exploitation, would that be considered a hate crime? Let me know in the comments, because what they discover next proves this was bigger than one family's secrets. There's more, Angela said, her voice barely above a whisper. She'd found a manila folder tucked behind the ledger, thick with photographs and documents. Much more. The photographs spilled across the desk like evidence from a crime scene. Not family photos, surveillance photos. Professional-grade images of women and children, taken from distance with telephoto lenses. Richard Graves had been watching his abandoned children. That's my mother, Marcus said, pointing to a grainy photo of a young Latina woman pushing a stroller through an El Paso parking lot. She's so young. Jerome's hands shook as he found images of his grandmother walking him to elementary school, unaware they were being photographed by the man who'd abandoned them both. He knew, Olivia's voice cut through the silence like a scalpel. All these years, he knew exactly how we were living. He watched us struggle while he built monuments to his own generosity. The Graves Foundation. Children's hospitals, scholarship programs, inner-city youth centers. All funded by money that should have supported his own abandoned children. The sick bastard was literally stealing from us to fund his charity work, Michael said, the pieces clicking together with horrible clarity. Subscribe and tell me what you think. Was Richard Graves evil or just a product of his time? Because what they find in the filing cabinet will answer that question forever. Angela opened the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, revealing rows of legal documents bound in red ribbon. Adoption papers. Birth certificates with fathers' names whited out. Court orders sealing records. He didn't just abandon us, she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. He legally erased us. Made us disappear from official records while keeping private documentation of everything. The truth hit Michael like a physical blow. His father hadn't just made mistakes, he'd run a decades-long operation to systematically erase his crimes while maintaining detailed records of his victims. For insurance. For blackmail. For control. Look at this. Jerome held up a thick legal document dated just 6 months before Richard's death. Amendment to the Graves Family Trust. Any previously unknown heirs must provide DNA evidence and overcome a legal presumption of illegitimacy. Even from beyond the grave, Richard Graves was still fighting his children. He knew we'd come eventually, Marcus said, his mechanic's hands clenched into fists that could crush steel. He spent his last months building legal walls to keep us from claiming what was ours. The room fell silent except for the grandfather clock ticking in the corner, the same clock that had measured out decades of lies. There's something else, Olivia said quietly, holding up a smaller notebook bound in cracked leather. Personal entries. His thoughts about us. Should they read their dead father's private thoughts about abandoning them? Comment below, because what's written inside will either break them or set them free. Michael reached for the notebook, but Olivia pulled it back. Are you sure you want to know what he really thought about his family? We're not his family, Michael said bitterly. We're his victims. All of us. Olivia opened to a random page and began reading aloud. Michael shows promise in mathematics. Excellent breeding stock for continuing the Graves legacy. The others serve different purposes. Olivia's mother has useful political connections in Harlem. Marcus's mother provides access to Latino voting blocks. Angela's situation offers opportunities in casino development. The words weren't written about children. They were written about assets. He never saw us as human beings, Jerome said, his voice hollow. We were just tools for building his empire. But the worst revelation was yet to come. Michael flipped to the final entries, dated just weeks before Richard's death. Michael must never know about the others. The boy has too much conscience. Inherited from his mother's side. If he discovers the full scope of our strategic family planning, he might attempt misguided reconciliation. The Graves' fortune must remain consolidated. Legacy protection requires continued separation from complications. Strategic family planning. Legacy protection. Complications. That's all they'd ever been to Richard Graves, complications to be managed. Subscribe now, because what Michael does with this knowledge will determine whether the Graves legacy becomes a force for justice or remains a monument to systematic oppression. I'm going to be sick, Michael said, rushing to the window and gulping frigid air. Outside, the Hamptons' winter landscape stretched endlessly, perfectly manicured lawns where he'd played as a child, tennis courts where he'd learned to serve, stables where he'd ridden horses worth more than most people's houses. All of it built on the systematic abandonment of his siblings. Now you know, Olivia said, joining him at the window. This is what your inheritance really cost. Not just money, entire lives. Entire communities kept in poverty so one family could live like royalty. The weight of generational wealth suddenly felt like generational guilt. But there's hope, Angela said, spreading out a map of the United States on Richard's desk. The ledger gives us locations for 8 more siblings. If we can find them, if we can prove the pattern, we can destroy the entire system that created this, Marcus finished. Not just your family's reputation, the whole network of powerful men who think they can erase their crimes with checkbooks. Because Richard Graves hadn't operated alone. The ledger contained references to other names, other families, other men who'd used similar tactics to maintain their reputations while abandoning inconvenient children. A conspiracy of abandonment spanning decades and involving some of America's most powerful families. If you could expose a network of wealthy men systematically abandoning children, would you risk everything to bring them down? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because what Michael decides next will echo through American history. We need to find them all, Michael said, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised even him. Every last one. Every abandoned child, every silenced mother, every family destroyed by these monsters. The 5 siblings looked at each other, united by shared DNA and shared purpose. It won't be easy, Jerome warned. Some of them might not want to be found. Some might be too afraid to come forward. And some might be dead, Olivia added quietly. Poverty kills, Michael. Your father knew that. He was counting on it. But not all of them were dead. The ledger entries were too recent, the surveillance photos too fresh. Somewhere out there, 3 more Graves children were living lives touched by abandonment, wondering why their fathers never came back, never sent support, never acknowledged their existence. 3 more lives that could be changed forever if Michael kept his promise. Where do we start? He asked. Olivia smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her, and pointed to an entry near the bottom of the ledger. April 2010, S. Clearwater, Seattle General, $100,000. Sarah Clearwater. Native American woman, early 30s now. Works as a nurse at the same hospital where her mother gave birth to her half-sister. Her half-sister. Another Graves child. The most recent entry. The freshest trail. The best chance of finding living family members who could help them expose the full scope of Richard Graves' crimes. Seattle, Michael said, already reaching for his phone to charter a jet. Together, Marcus said firmly. We do this as family, or we don't do it at all. Subscribe and tell me, when is the last time you did something that could change the world? Because these 5 siblings are about to rewrite the rules about wealth, power, and family responsibility in America. As the sun set over the Hamptons mansion that had sheltered so many lies, 5 children of Richard Graves prepared for a journey that would either destroy them or set an entire generation of abandoned children free. The real work was just beginning. But for the first time in 43 years, they weren't doing it alone. What do you do when finding your family means destroying everything you thought you knew about justice? The private jet cut through storm clouds over the Pacific Northwest, carrying 5 souls toward a reckoning 43 years in the making. Below them, Seattle's skyline emerged from the rain like a mirage built from steel and broken dreams. Michael stared out the window at the city where his father had left another woman, another child, another family to struggle in silence. The turbulence matched the chaos in his chest, anger, guilt, and something else he couldn't name. Hope. First time flying commercial in your private jet? Marcus asked from across the aisle, his mechanic's coveralls replaced by a borrowed suit that didn't quite fit his broad shoulders. First time flying with family, Michael replied, the word still foreign on his tongue. Subscribe now if you want to know what happens when abandoned siblings confront their father's final victim, because what they discover in Seattle will change everything they thought they knew about survival. Angela spread hospital blueprints across her tray table, her long black hair falling forward as she studied the layout. Seattle General. Sarah Clearwater works the night shift in pediatric intensive care. Been there 12 years, according to the employee directory I acquired. You hacked a hospital? Jerome looked impressed. I prefer, digitally investigated, Angela smiled. Reservation schools don't teach computer science, but poverty teaches creativity. The plane banked left, giving them a view of Elliott Bay stretching toward the Olympic Mountains. Somewhere in that sprawling city lived their half-sister, a woman who had no idea her life was about to change forever. Or that her biological father had been watching her from the shadows for over a decade. If someone told you that your anonymous father was actually a billionaire who abandoned you intentionally, how would you react? Comment below where you're watching from, because Sarah Clearwater's response will shock everyone. What if she doesn't want to be found? Olivia asked quietly. What if she's built a life that doesn't include space for a family that abandoned her? The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Michael had been wondering the same thing. In his world, problems got solved with money, influence, and carefully crafted legal documents. But this wasn't his world anymore. This was the world where his siblings had learned to survive without him. Then we respect her choice, he said finally. But we give her the choice. That's more than our father ever did. Seattle General Hospital at 11 p.m. looked like a fortress of fluorescent lights and human suffering. The pediatric intensive care unit hummed with quiet desperation, machines keeping tiny hearts beating, monitors tracking breaths too precious to waste. And somewhere in this maze of medical miracles worked their sister, Sarah Clearwater. The desk nurse looked up from her computer, tired eyes assessing the unlikely group standing before her. A billionaire in a $3,000 coat, a mechanic, a reservation woman, a young black artist, and a homeless advocate who cleaned up surprisingly well. She's with a patient, the nurse continued. Family emergency? More like family revelation. Something like that, Olivia said, her voice carrying just enough authority to avoid further questions. Hit that subscribe button because what happens when they finally meet Sarah will redefine what it means to be abandoned, and what it means to be found. They waited in the family consultation room, 5 nervous people surrounded by tissues, pamphlets about grief counseling, and chairs designed for the worst conversations of people's lives. Michael found himself wondering how many families had received devastating news in this exact spot. How many children had lost parents while he lived in luxury, unaware that his own siblings were fighting for survival. The door opened, and Sarah Clearwater walked in. She was beautiful in the way that surviving trauma makes some people beautiful, carved by hardship into something stronger than ordinary genetics could produce. Native American features mixed with unmistakable Graves bone structure. High cheekbones, intelligent dark eyes, and hands that had clearly spent years healing others. But it was her expression that stopped everyone cold. She knew exactly who they were. "Took you long enough," Sarah said, settling into a chair with the confidence of someone who'd been expecting this conversation for years. "I was starting to think the great Michael Graves would never come looking for his lost family." The words hit the room like lightning strikes. You knew." Michael's voice cracked like a teenager's. Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I've known since I was 16. Amazing what DNA testing and a decent internet connection can accomplish when you're desperate enough to understand why your mother drank herself to death at 34. If you discovered your half-siblings were looking for you, would you be angry or grateful? Let me know in the comments, because Sarah's reaction will challenge everything they thought they knew about abandonment." The silence stretched until Jerome spoke up. "How long have you been watching us?" "Watching you?" Sarah's eyebrows rose. "Brother, I've been 3 steps ahead of you since before you knew I existed. Did you really think you were the first abandoned Graves child to go looking for answers?" She pulled out a tablet, swiping to reveal surveillance photos, recent ones. Michael leaving his Manhattan office. Olivia at the Bethesda fountain. Marcus working under the hood of a car. Angela teaching children on the reservation. They'd been hunting their father's secrets while their sister had been hunting them. "I know about the ledger," Sarah continued. "I know about the surveillance photos. I know about the trust fund amendments and the sealed adoption records. What I don't know is why you think I'd want anything to do with the family that threw me away like garbage." The accusation hung between them like a blade. "Sarah," Olivia said gently, "we didn't know." "You didn't know because you didn't want to know." Sarah's voice could have frozen the Puget Sound. "How many years did you live in that mansion, Michael, walking past homeless people without seeing them? How many times did you donate to charity instead of acknowledging that your own family was struggling in poverty?" Every word was a perfectly aimed arrow, hitting targets Michael didn't know he was carrying. "I didn't know you existed," he said weakly. "But you knew something was wrong. Every rich white man knows when his wealth comes from somewhere dark. You just chose not to look. Subscribe and tell me, is ignorance a valid defense when your privilege comes from someone else's suffering?" Because what Sarah reveals next will force everyone to confront the true cost of willful blindness. Marcus leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "What do you want from us, Hermana?" "What do I want?" Sarah stood up, pacing to the window that overlooked the Seattle skyline. "I want my mother back. I want the childhood I lost to foster care. I want the college education I couldn't afford. I want the medical school acceptance I had to turn down because I was working 3 jobs to survive." Each want was a small knife, cutting deeper than the last. "But since none of that is possible," she continued, "I want something else entirely." The room held its breath. "I want you to meet Luna." "Luna?" Sarah opened the door and gestured down the hallway. Through the ICU window, they could see her talking to a young girl, maybe 8 years old, with Sarah's eyes and Richard Graves' stubborn chin. Another generation. Another Graves child. Luna Clearwater Graves, Sarah said quietly. My daughter. Your niece. Richard's granddaughter. The child he never knew existed because I learned from watching you all that Graves men don't stick around for the hard parts. The revelation hit like a tsunami. If you just discovered you were an uncle to a child you never knew existed, how would you feel? Comment below where you're watching from, because what Luna needs will test every assumption they have about family responsibility. Michael's knees nearly buckled. How old? 8. Born 3 months premature because I couldn't afford prenatal care. Spent her first 2 years in and out of hospitals because I couldn't afford the specialists she needed. She's brilliant, tested gifted at 5, but she goes to underfunded public schools because I can't afford private education on a nurse's salary. Every word was an indictment of systemic inequality. She asks about her grandfather sometimes, Sarah continued. I tell her he was a man who made hard choices. I don't tell her that one of those choices was pretending she didn't exist. Angela wiped tears from her eyes. What does she need? What she needs and what she's going to get are two different things, Sarah said firmly. Luna needs a stable home, excellent schools, healthcare that doesn't depend on my employee benefits, and family members who won't disappear when things get difficult. But there was something else in Sarah's voice. Something that suggested this conversation was heading somewhere none of them expected. However, Sarah said, settling back into her chair, what she's going to get is something much more dangerous. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. She's going to get the truth about the Graves family legacy. All of it. The abandoned children, the systematic racism, the blood money that built the fortune. And then she's going to help us decide what justice looks like for the next generation. 8-year-old Luna would grow up knowing exactly what her family was capable of, both the evil and the possibility for redemption. Subscribe now because what Sarah demands next will force Michael to choose between protecting his wealth and protecting his family's future. You want her to know everything? Michael asked. I want her to choose her own relationship with the Graves legacy. But first, I need to know if there's going to be a legacy worth choosing. Sarah walked to a whiteboard mounted on the consultation room wall and began writing names. Olivia Washington Graves, abandoned 1978. Marcus Rodriguez Graves, abandoned 1982. Angela Yazzie Graves, abandoned 1985. Jerome Washington Graves, abandoned 1999. Sarah Clearwater Graves, abandoned 2010. And below those, 3 question marks. According to the ledger, there are 3 more of us out there somewhere. 3 more siblings who don't know they're part of this family. 3 more lives that Richard Graves destroyed before he died. She turned to face them, and her expression was harder than Seattle winter rain. Here's my offer. We find the remaining 3 siblings. We divide the inheritance equally among all 8 children, including Luna's share held in trust. We use that money to build something Richard would have hated, a foundation that supports abandoned children, single mothers, and communities destroyed by generational wealth. The proposal was breathtaking in its scope. And if Michael refuses? Jerome asked. Sarah smiled, and for the first time, it reached her eyes. Then Luna grows up knowing she had family members who chose money over blood. And when she turns 18, she gets her inheritance anyway, along with every piece of evidence we've collected about the Graves family crimes. The next generation would inherit not just wealth, but the full truth about how that wealth was acquired. If an 8-year-old girl held the key to your family's redemption, would you trust her judgment? Let me know in the comments, because what Michael decides next will echo through generations. Michael looked at his siblings, the family he'd never known he had, the people who'd survived everything his father had done to erase them. Then he looked through the window at Luna, who was teaching origami to another young patient, her small hands folding paper into birds that would never fly. But maybe, if they did this right, Luna would. "How do we find the others?" he asked. The question hung in the air like a promise, like the first honest thing the Graves family had built in 43 years. Sarah's smile widened, and suddenly the consultation room felt less like a place where families received bad news and more like a place where families decided to fight back against the systems that tried to destroy them. "Leave that to me," she said. "I've been tracking Graves' family crimes for 12 years. I know exactly where to look." But as the 5 siblings planned their search for the remaining family members, none of them noticed the figure watching from the hospital parking lot. Someone else had been tracking the Graves family's secrets, someone with their own plans for justice. And those plans didn't include happy family reunions. Subscribe and tell me where you're watching from, because what happens next will force the Graves siblings to choose between saving their family and saving themselves. The hunt for the final 3 siblings was about to begin. But they weren't the only ones hunting. What happens when the hunter becomes the hunted? The abandoned warehouse in Seattle's International District looked like a tomb for forgotten dreams. Rain drummed against broken windows while inside, 6 members of the Graves family huddled around laptops and scattered documents, hunting for ghosts their father had tried to bury forever. Sarah's command center was impressive. 3 years of investigation condensed into filing cabinets, wall charts, and enough surveillance equipment to make the FBI jealous. Photos of potential siblings covered every surface, connected by red string like a conspiracy theorist's fever dream. But this conspiracy was real. "Found him," Angela announced, pointing at her laptop screen. David Blackhorse Graves. Born 1987, Billings, Montana. Mother died in a car accident when he was 12, right after she tried to contact Richard for child support. The 6th sibling. Another life destroyed by their father's systematic abandonment. Michael studied the surveillance photos Sarah had somehow acquired, a man in his mid-30s wearing military fatigues, standing beside an armored vehicle in what looked like Afghanistan. "Army Ranger," Sarah said, reading from her files. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq. Discharged with PTSD in 2018 after his unit was ambushed. Currently works private security in Billings. Subscribe now if you want to know why David Blackhorse might be the most dangerous Graves sibling, because what he's been doing since leaving the military will change everything. Private security. Marcus looked up from his own research. Or mercenary work. Both, Sarah replied grimly. David's been hunting Richard Graves for 5 years. Not for money, for revenge. He blames our father for his mother's death, and he spent his military training learning how to make people disappear. The warehouse fell silent except for rain against broken glass. Jerome's artist hands stopped tracing genealogy charts. "You think he's the one who's been watching us?" Before Sarah could answer, her phone buzzed with an incoming text. "Unknown number. Stop looking for me, or I'll stop you permanently. D." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gun that had already been fired. "He knows we're here," Olivia whispered. Michael felt ice water replace the blood in his veins. In his world, problems got solved with lawyers and NDAs. But David Blackhorse lived in a world where problems got solved with violence. If your long-lost brother was a trained killer who blamed your father for his mother's death, would you try to find him or run? Comment below where you're watching from, because what happens next will test every assumption about family bonds. "We need to call the police," Michael said, reaching for his phone. "And tell them what?" Angela challenged. "That our billionaire father systematically abandoned Native American children and now one of them wants justice. You think Seattle PD is going to take our side?" She had a point. The police weren't exactly known for protecting indigenous communities from wealthy white families. Sarah walked to the window, scanning the empty street below. David's not just angry about abandonment. According to military records I accessed, he discovered something about his mother's death that drove him over the edge. What kind of something? The car accident wasn't an accident. The words hit the warehouse like lightning. Richard had her killed. Michael's voice cracked like breaking ice. Not directly. But he made sure she couldn't afford car maintenance, blocked her from getting decent employment, destroyed her credit rating. When her brakes failed on an icy Montana highway, she couldn't afford to fix them. Sarah's voice carried the weight of accumulated rage. David has the insurance reports, the mechanical inspection, the financial records. He can prove our father murdered his mother through systematic poverty. Subscribe because what they discover about Richard's methods will expose a network of violence that reaches into the highest levels of American power. Marcus slammed his fist against the wall. How many more mothers did he kill this way? 7 that I can document, Sarah replied, pulling out another file. Car accidents, medical complications from untreated conditions, overdoses from despair. Richard didn't need to pull triggers, he just had to make sure his abandoned families couldn't access the resources needed to survive. The systematic nature of it was breathtaking. Murder by poverty, executed through the legal system and financial institutions. David's been building a case, Sarah continued. Not for civil court, for the International Criminal Court. He wants Richard Graves posthumously tried for crimes against humanity. Even dead, their father was still destroying lives. Angela studied the surveillance photos David had been taking of them. Professional quality, taken with military precision. He's not just hunting for justice. He's hunting for evidence. He needs all of us alive to testify. Then why the death threats? Jerome asked. Because he doesn't trust us, Olivia said quietly. From his perspective, we're the privileged children who got to live while he watched his mother die in poverty. We're complicit in the system that destroyed his family. The horrible truth was that he wasn't wrong. If you had to choose between your family's safety and exposing a system of murder, what would you choose? Let me know in the comments, because what Sarah suggests next will put all their lives at risk. We have to meet with him, Sarah said finally. Are you insane? Michael's billionaire composure cracked completely. He's a trained killer who wants us dead. He's our brother who wants our father held accountable for mass murder, Sarah corrected. There's a difference. But was there? In David's world, justice and vengeance had become the same thing. Sarah's phone rang. Unknown caller. She answered on speaker. Sarah Clearwater Graves. David's voice carried the flat precision of someone trained to kill without emotion. You've been looking for me. The warehouse held its collective breath. Hello, David, Sarah said calmly. We need to talk. Talk. David laughed, but there was no humor in it. You want to talk about how Daddy's fortune bought your medical degree while my mother bled to death in a Montana emergency room because she couldn't afford treatment. The accusation hit Sarah like a physical blow. I earned my nursing degree working 3 jobs, she said quietly. With what money? Where did the down payment for your apartment come from? The car you drove to nursing school? The computer you used for applications? David's voice cut like surgical steel. Richard Graves left trust funds for all his legitimate children. Even the ones he pretended to abandon. The revelation shattered everything they thought they knew about their situations. Subscribe now because what David reveals about secret trust funds will rewrite the entire story of abandonment, and prove that some siblings were more abandoned than others. That's impossible, Michael said. We checked all the financial records. You checked the records you were allowed to see, David interrupted. Richard kept 3 sets of books. The public ones for tax purposes. The private ones for hush money. And the secret ones for insurance. Insurance. The word carried implications none of them wanted to explore. What kind of insurance? Angela asked. The kind that makes sure some abandoned children survive to tell the story, while others disappear completely. David's voice could have frozen the Seattle rain. Some of you got secret support. Education funds, medical coverage, housing assistance, all untraceable to Richard, but keeping you alive and functional. The warehouse spun around Michael as the implications hit him. Others got nothing, David continued. Nothing except surveillance to make sure they stayed nothing. My mother. Marcus's mother. Jerome's grandmother. They were marked for elimination through poverty. Not abandoned, selected for destruction. You're saying Richard chose which children lived and which died? Olivia whispered. I'm saying Richard Graves ran a 40-year eugenics experiment, using his own children as test subjects. The ones who showed useful genetics got secret support. The ones who didn't. The systematic horror of it was beyond comprehension. If you discovered your father had been selectively murdering his own children through poverty, would you want justice or revenge? Comment below where you're watching from, because what David demands next will force everyone to choose sides. What do you want from us? Michael asked. I want you to help me finish what I started. Full exposure of Richard Graves and everyone who helped him. Names, dates, financial records, the whole network of wealthy men who've been murdering inconvenient children for generations. Because Richard hadn't operated alone. The secret trust funds, the surveillance, the systematic elimination of witnesses, it required institutional support. And if we refuse? Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. Then you become part of the cover-up. And people who cover up mass murder. David's pause stretched like a death sentence. Well, they don't usually live long enough to enjoy their blood money. The threat was clear. Help expose the truth, or become victims of it. Where do you want to meet? Michael asked, his voice steady despite the terror coursing through his veins. Pike Place Market. Tomorrow at noon. Public, crowded, lots of witnesses. David's tactical thinking was flawless. Bring the ledger, the surveillance photos, and everything else Sarah's collected. We're going to build a case that will bring down the entire system. The line went dead, leaving 6 people in a warehouse to contemplate whether they were about to save their family or destroy it. Subscribe and tell me what you would do, because tomorrow at Pike Place Market, the Graves siblings will either unite against the system that created them, or watch it destroy them all. He's right, you know, Angela said quietly. About the secret support. I got a scholarship to law school that I could never track to its source. Anonymous benefactor. My medical bills when I was premature, Sarah admitted. Always mysteriously covered by charity care that the hospital couldn't explain. One by one, they began to realize the horrible truth. They hadn't all been abandoned equally. Some had been selected for survival, others marked for death. Richard Graves hadn't just been a deadbeat father, he'd been a mass murderer who used the legal system and financial institutions as weapons. And tomorrow, they would either help expose his crimes or become his final victims. We need to find the last 2 siblings before we meet David, Michael said. If we're going to do this, we do it with everyone. But time was running out, and somewhere in Seattle, a trained killer was preparing for a reckoning 40 years in the making. The truth was finally coming out. The only question was whether any of them would survive to tell it. When the moment of truth arrives, will you choose justice or survival? Pike Place Market at noon buzzed with its usual chaos. Tourists buying overpriced salmon, street musicians competing for attention, vendors hawking everything from handmade jewelry to questionable seafood. But beneath the familiar symphony of commerce, 6 members of the Graves family prepared for a confrontation that would either expose the greatest systematic crime in American history or get them all killed. Michael adjusted his earpiece, connected to Sarah's surveillance equipment hidden throughout the market. "I still think this is insane," he whispered into his collar mic. "Insanity is letting mass murderers die peacefully in their beds," David's voice crackled through the comm system. "Our father killed 17 women and destroyed 43 children's lives. Today, we make that public. But they weren't the only ones listening. Subscribe now if you want to know who else is hunting the Graves family, because what happens in the next 10 minutes will determine whether justice prevails or gets buried with the witnesses." Olivia positioned herself near the fish-throwing vendors, manila envelopes containing evidence tucked inside her coat. Around her, unsuspecting shoppers continued their mundane Saturday routines, unaware they were about to witness the exposure of generational wealth built on systematic murder. Visual on target, Angela's voice came through clearly. She'd spotted David near the flower stands, 6'2", military-bearing, eyes that missed nothing. Even in civilian clothes, he moved like someone trained to kill. But he wasn't alone. "We've got company," Marcus hissed from his position near the spice merchants. 3 men in black suits, moving through the crowd. Professional security. Michael's blood turned to ice water. Corporate security, he realized. Someone knows we're here. But who? Only the 6 of them knew about the meeting. Unless David had been compromised. Unless the network Richard worked with was still active, still protecting the interests of wealthy men who couldn't afford to have their crimes exposed. If powerful people were willing to kill to protect their secrets, would you still fight for justice? Comment below where you're watching from, because what the Graves siblings do next will echo through history. "Sarah," Michael whispered urgently, "get Luna out of here. Now." But Sarah's 8-year-old daughter was nowhere to be seen. The child who was supposed to be safely hidden in the car with a trusted babysitter had vanished. That's when they knew this wasn't just surveillance. It was an execution. "Luna!" Sarah's scream cut through the market noise like a gunshot. Vendors stopped mid-pitch. Tourists turned to stare. The carefully orchestrated plan dissolved into chaos. And in that chaos, David Blackhorse Graves made his move. The former Army Ranger appeared behind one of the black-suited men like a ghost materializing from smoke. Before the corporate security officer could react, David's arm wrapped around his throat in a chokehold that would render him unconscious in seconds. But the other 2 were already drawing weapons. Subscribe and tell me, when violence erupts around innocent people, is it worth fighting for truth? Because what happens next will test everything these siblings believe about justice. "Gun!" someone screamed. Pike Place Market exploded into pandemonium. Tourists scattered, vendors dove behind stalls, and somewhere in the chaos, Luna's terrified voice called out, "Mommy." Michael saw her first, 8 years old, being dragged toward a black SUV by a man who definitely wasn't there for the salmon. Without thinking, without calculating the risk to his billion-dollar empire, Michael Graves did something he'd never done in his life. He chose family over self-preservation. The tackle that brought down Luna's kidnapper was clumsy, desperate, and completely ineffective from a technical standpoint. But it bought enough time for David to eliminate the second gunman with military precision and for Marcus to grab Luna, shielding her with his mechanic's body as bullets shattered storefront windows. Blood on the cobblestones. Screams echoing off ancient brick. The smell of gunpowder mixing with fresh fish and terror. "This way!" Angela shouted, leading them through a maze of vendor stalls toward the back exit. Her reservation upbringing had taught her how to disappear when powerful people wanted you gone. But they weren't fast enough. The third gunman had positioned himself perfectly. Jerome saw him first, standing near the exit, weapon drawn, professional calm in his eyes as he prepared to eliminate 6 witnesses to crimes that could topple governments. Time slowed to the speed of heartbeats. If you had 1 second to save your family or save yourself, which would you choose? Hit that subscribe button because what Jerome does next will redefine heroism. The young artist who'd spent his life creating beauty threw himself between the gunman and his family without hesitation. The bullets meant for Michael, Sarah, Luna, and the others found Jerome instead. 3 shots. Center mass. Professional execution. Jerome Washington Graves, age 25, died protecting the siblings he'd known for less than a week. But his sacrifice gave them the seconds they needed. David's return shot was precise, final, and absolutely justified. The last gunman dropped beside Jerome's body, his blood mixing with that of the young man who'd chosen love over survival. The market fell silent except for sirens in the distance and Luna's quiet sobbing. "We have to go," David said, his voice hollow. "Police will be here in 2 minutes, and we can't explain this without exposing everything." But Sarah knelt beside Jerome's body, her nurse's hands trying uselessly to stop bleeding that had already stopped. "He's gone," she whispered. The price of justice had claimed its first victim. Subscribe and tell me, when fighting evil costs innocent lives, is it still worth fighting? Because what the survivors do next will honor Jerome's sacrifice or make it meaningless. Michael looked at his dying brother, the artist who'd folded paper birds for sick children, who'd spent his life creating beauty despite being abandoned by a father who saw him as disposable. And something inside Michael Graves finally broke. Not his composure. Not his business acumen. His willingness to let other people pay the price for his family's crimes. "No more," he said quietly. "Michael?" Olivia looked up from where she was helping Sarah close Jerome's eyes. "No more hiding. No more protecting the fortune. No more letting other people die for Richard Graves' sins." Michael's voice carried a conviction that surprised even him. "We're going public. Everything. Today." But David shook his head grimly. "Going public won't work. The media is controlled by the same network that tried to kill us. The police are bought. The courts are compromised." His military training had taught him how systems of power really functioned. "There's only one way to make sure this story gets told." He pulled out his phone, opening an encrypted app. "International Criminal Court in The Hague. I've been building this case for 3 years. Jerome's murder just provided the final piece of evidence we needed, proof that the network is still active, still willing to kill to protect their secrets." The phone screen showed a file labeled, "Graves Foundation Crimes Against Humanity," ready for transmission. "Once I hit send," David continued, "there's no going back. The ICC will issue international warrants for everyone involved in Richard's network. Living and dead. It will destroy not just our family's reputation, but dozens of America's most powerful families." The weight of that decision settled over them like lead blankets. If exposing your father's crimes would destroy dozens of innocent families along with the guilty ones, would you still do it? Comment below where you're watching from, because their choice will reshape American society. Angela looked around at the aftermath, Jerome's body, the terrified market vendors, Luna clinging to her mother, blood on historic cobblestones. "How many more Jeromes will die if we don't do this?" she asked quietly. The question hung in the air like smoke from gunfire. "And how many more Lunas will grow up without fathers if we do?" Michael countered, thinking of all the powerful men whose families would be destroyed by association. But Sarah, still holding her daughter, provided the answer that settled everything. "Luna, baby, what do you think Jerome would want us to do?" The 8-year-old looked up at the adults with eyes too old for her face. He drew birds, she said quietly. Birds that were supposed to fly free. He wouldn't want anyone else to be trapped in cages. Out of the mouths of babes came the moral clarity adults had lost. David's finger hovered over the send button. Last chance to walk away. Once this goes out, we're all either heroes or dead. No middle ground. Michael looked at Jerome's body, at Luna's tear-stained face, at his siblings who'd survived 40 years of systematic oppression only to lose their brother to the same evil that had destroyed their childhoods. The choice was suddenly simple. Send it, he said. David's finger pressed the screen. In that instant, decades of carefully constructed lies began to crumble. Somewhere in The Hague, prosecutors started preparing cases against some of America's most powerful families. And in Pike Place Market, 5 survivors and 1 little girl began the long journey toward justice. Subscribe and tell me what you think justice looks like, because what happens next will determine whether Jerome's sacrifice changes the world or just adds another body to the pile of inconvenient truths. As sirens grew louder and media helicopters appeared overhead, the surviving members of the Graves family faced the cameras that would carry their story around the world. But the most powerful statement came from 8-year-old Luna, who looked directly into the CNN camera and said, "My grandfather hurt a lot of people. My uncle Jerome died trying to fix that. Now we're going to make sure no other kids grow up without daddies because rich people think poor people don't matter." From the mouths of babes, the truth that would topple empires. The reckoning had begun. But the final twist was yet to come. Some secrets are worth dying for. Others are worth living for. 6 months after Jerome's blood stained the cobblestones of Pike Place Market, the world had changed in ways both profound and heartbreaking. The International Criminal Court's investigation had exposed a network of systematic child abandonment involving 47 of America's wealthiest families, spanning 7 decades of carefully orchestrated crimes. But the final truth, the one that would reshape everything the Graves siblings thought they knew about their family, was waiting in an unmarked grave outside Billings, Montana. Subscribe now if you want to know the secret that Richard Graves died protecting, because what they discover today will redefine the meaning of family, sacrifice, and redemption. Michael stood beside the freshly dug grave, expensive suit replaced by jeans and work boots, billionaire's arrogance replaced by something that looked almost like humility. Around him, his surviving siblings held hands in a circle that would have been impossible 7 months ago. Olivia, the homeless advocate who'd started it all. Marcus, whose calloused hands had built more than his father ever destroyed. Angela, whose law degree was finally being used to help her own people. Sarah, who'd traded her nurse's uniform for the prosecutor's badge she'd always deserved. David, whose military precision had saved them all. And Luna, now 9 years old, holding origami birds she'd folded for the uncle she'd never really gotten to meet. Jerome Washington Graves, the minister said quietly. Beloved son, brother, artist, and hero. But they weren't just burying Jerome today. They were burying the lies that had defined the Graves family for 70 years. If you could rewrite your family's entire history, would you? Comment below where you're watching from, because what happens after the funeral will show whether true justice is possible or just another beautiful dream. The reading of Richard Graves' final will had taken place that morning in a sterile conference room that smelled of leather and legal documents. Michael expected the usual billionaire theatrics, charitable donations designed for tax breaks, trust funds with impossible conditions, maybe a few final insults for the children he'd abandoned. What he didn't expect was a confession. The video screen flickered to life, showing Richard Graves in his final months, cancer-thin, hollow-eyed, but still carrying the arrogance that had destroyed so many lives. If you're watching this, his recorded voice filled the conference room, then my crimes have finally caught up with the family name. Good. It's about time. The siblings exchanged glances. This wasn't the Richard they remembered. I've spent 70 years building an empire on the backs of women I discarded and children I abandoned. 43 beautiful souls brought into this world and thrown away like yesterday's newspapers. I told myself I was protecting the family legacy. His laugh was bitter as winter wind. What I was really protecting was my own cowardice. Subscribe because what Richard reveals next will explain why he abandoned his children, and why the truth is more heartbreaking than anyone imagined. The video continued. The truth is, I didn't abandon my children because I was evil. I abandoned them because I was terrified. Terrified that they were better people than I could ever be. Terrified that they would see through the lies I told myself about deserving wealth built on others' suffering. Michael felt his world tilt sideways. Every trust fund I established, every scholarship I secretly funded, every medical bill I anonymously paid, it wasn't charity. It was cowardice. I kept my abandoned children alive from a distance because I couldn't face them up close. Because I knew they would ask the one question I could never answer. The room held its breath. Why wasn't I enough for you to stay? The words hit like physical blows. This wasn't the monster they'd imagined. This was something worse, a broken man who'd chosen comfort over courage for 7 decades. If your worst enemy turned out to be just as damaged as his victims, would you forgive him? Let me know in the comments, because what the will reveals about inheritance will shock everyone. I'm dividing my entire fortune equally among all my children. Every offshore account, every stock portfolio, every piece of real estate. Not because I'm generous, because I'm guilty. This money belongs to the families I destroyed to build it. But that wasn't the shocking part. However, there's one condition. You must find and acknowledge the 43rd child. The one I abandoned not through cowardice, but through circumstances I couldn't control. The child whose mother I loved more than life itself, but couldn't save. 43rd child. They'd only found 8 of the siblings. There were 35 more out there somewhere. Subscribe now because what Richard reveals about the lost children will rewrite everything you thought you knew about abandonment and love. The video continued with coordinates, latitude and longitude that led to a small cemetery outside Tucson, Arizona. And a name that made Michael's blood run cold. Isabella Graves. Born 1951. Died 1952. My firstborn. My greatest loss. The child whose death taught me that love wasn't enough to protect the people who mattered most. Richard's first child hadn't been abandoned. She died. And every child he'd abandoned since was an attempt to avoid the pain of loving someone he might lose. Find her grave. Read the headstone. Understand that every terrible thing I did afterward was because I couldn't bear to love that deeply again. The video ended with coordinates to 34 more graves scattered across America. 34 children who died in infancy, in childhood, in circumstances Richard could have prevented if he'd stayed, if he'd fought, if he'd chosen love over self-preservation. 8 living siblings. 35 graves. 1 dying wish for forgiveness. If you discovered your father's cruelty came from unprocessed grief, would that change how you judged him? Comment below where you're watching from, because what the siblings do next will define justice for the next generation. The cemetery outside Tucson felt like hallowed ground when they found Isabella's grave 3 days later. The headstone was simple. Isabella Marie Graves. Beloved daughter. Too beautiful for this world. 1951 to 1952. Below that, in Richard's handwriting, words added decades later. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to love again. Luna, now the family's unofficial moral compass, placed origami birds on each of the 35 graves they visited over the following month. Tiny paper souls for children who'd never gotten the chance to fly. Were they our brothers and sisters too? She asked at the final grave. an unnamed infant buried in a potter's field in Detroit. Yes, Sarah said quietly. They were all our family. The living and the dead. The abandoned and the lost. All children of a man too broken to choose healing over hiding. Subscribe and tell me what you think. Can understanding evil make it forgivable? Because what Michael decides about the inheritance will echo through generations. The final board meeting of Graves Industries took place in the same conference room where Michael had learned his siblings' names 6 months earlier. But this time, every chair was filled with abandoned children who'd survived their father's systematic cruelty. Not just the 8 original siblings. The ICC investigation had uncovered 27 more living children, scattered across 3 continents. Each one carrying Richard's DNA and the scars of his abandonment. 35 survivors. 35 voices. 35 votes on how to use blood money for healing. The inheritance totals $14.7 billion, Michael announced, his voice steady. Divided equally, that's $420 million per person. Generational wealth that could lift entire communities out of poverty. But Luna raised her small hand. What about the kids who are still out there? The ones whose daddies left them like granddaddy left you? Out of the mouths of babes, the question that mattered most. If you inherited billions of dollars built on systematic oppression, how would you use it? Let me know in the comments, because what they decide will change American society forever. The vote was unanimous. The Richard Graves Memorial Foundation would use the entire inheritance to support abandoned children, single mothers, and communities destroyed by generational wealth inequality. Not charity, reparations. Not handouts, justice. Every dollar Richard had stolen from his children's futures would be invested in making sure no other child grew up wondering why they weren't worth their father's love. But the final twist came from an unexpected source. As they signed the legal documents transferring the fortune, Sarah's phone rang. Unknown number. But this time, they weren't afraid. Is this Sarah Clearwater Graves? The voice was elderly, female, carrying an accent that suggested wealth and education. Yes. My name is Margaret Rothschild Graves. I'm calling about the International Criminal Court investigation into my late husband's activities. The room fell silent. Your husband? Richard Graves was my first husband. We were married from 1949 to 1953, before he legally changed his name and disappeared with our daughter Isabella. The final secret. The one that explained everything. Richard hadn't abandoned Isabella. He'd kidnapped her from her mother, then let her die rather than seek medical help that might have exposed his new identity. Subscribe because what Margaret reveals about Richard's true identity will rewrite the entire story of the Graves family, and prove that some secrets run deeper than blood. Richard's real name was Robert Morrison. He was wanted for embezzlement and fraud when he stole Isabella and created the Richard Graves identity. Every dollar of your inheritance was built on crimes that started 70 years ago. The phone call lasted 3 hours. By the end, they understood the final truth. Richard Graves had been a fugitive his entire life, building wealth to stay ahead of the crimes that defined him. Every abandoned child had been a potential witness. Every silenced mother had been a security threat. He hadn't abandoned them from lack of love. He'd abandoned them to avoid prison. If you learned that everything you believed about your family was built on a lie within a lie, how would you find the truth? Comment below where you're watching from. Because what the survivors do with this knowledge will define justice for the next century. 1 year later, Luna Washington Graves stood before the United Nations General Assembly, reading from a speech written in her careful 9-year-old handwriting. My granddaddy hurt a lot of people because he was scared and sad about losing his first little girl. That doesn't make it okay, but it makes it something we can understand. And if we can understand it, maybe we can fix it. In the audience, 35 survivors of systematic abandonment listen to a child teach the world about forgiveness without forgetting, healing without ignoring justice, and building futures that honored both the living and the dead. The Richard Graves Memorial Foundation had distributed $4 billion to support abandoned children in its first year of operation. Orphanages became community centers. Foster care systems got reformed. Single mothers got the support Richard's victims had been denied. But the most powerful change was simpler. Children who might have grown up wondering why they weren't enough for their fathers to stay now grew up knowing that sometimes, broken adults make terrible choices that have nothing to do with a child's worth. Subscribe and tell me what you think. Is it possible to build something beautiful from something terrible? Because what happens next will show whether redemption is possible or just another word for forgetting. The final scene took place in a garden behind the Foundation's headquarters in Seattle. Luna, now 10, taught origami to children whose fathers had abandoned them, whose mothers had been silenced, whose communities had been destroyed by systematic inequality. Paper birds for souls learning to fly. My uncle Jerome used to say that broken things could be made beautiful again, Luna told the children as they folded wings from colorful paper. You just have to be patient and gentle and remember that the cracks are where the light gets in. Around them, 35 adults who'd learned the same lesson worked to heal a world that had tried to throw them away. Michael, using his business skills to build sustainable support systems. Olivia, fighting for housing rights that their father had systematically denied. Marcus, teaching job skills to kids aging out of foster care. Angela, reforming legal systems that protected wealth over children. Sarah, training nurses to recognize signs of systematic abandonment. David, using his military training to protect families from the networks that tried to silence them. And Luna, reminding everyone that sometimes the most powerful revolution begins with a child asking a simple question. Why wasn't I enough? The answer, they'd learned, was never about the child. It was always about the adult who was too broken to choose healing over hiding. But broken things, as Jerome had taught them, could be made beautiful again. If you were patient. If you were gentle. And if you remembered that the cracks were where the light got in. Subscribe and share this story because sometimes, the most powerful truth is the simplest one: every child deserves to know they're enough, exactly as they are. The Graves family legacy had begun with systematic abandonment. It ended with systematic love. And in between, 35 survivors proved that blood might make you related, but choosing to heal together makes you family. The secret Olivia had promised to tell was finally complete. Help me, and I will tell you a secret. The secret is that broken people can choose to break cycles instead of breaking children. The secret is that justice and healing can coexist. The secret is that sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to abandon the next generation the way you were abandoned. The secret is that love, real love, is always a choice. And the Graves family finally chose correctly.